There's a saying among those who work with numbers instead of swords: the ledger never lies. But it can be taught to whisper. For 11 years, Mira Voss had been the empire's quietest weapon, and nobody in the palace knew it, least of all her. She was not a soldier. She had never held a blade with intent to use it. She wore gray, always gray, a color she had chosen deliberately because it drew no eyes and invited no questions, and she moved through the marble corridors of the treasury wing like a piece of furniture that occasionally needed to be stepped around. The clerks called her thorough. The junior accountants called her exhausting. Nobody called her dangerous because nobody had ever thought to ask what a woman who understood the empire's entire financial circulatory system might do if she found a clot. Her days followed a rhythm so precise it could have been set by a metronome. She arrived before the sun cleared the eastern towers. She left after the night clerks had already lit their second round of lamps. In between, she moved through columns of figures the way other people move through gossip, effortlessly, hungrily finding meaning in patterns that everyone else saw as gray noise. She had buried a husband 6 years earlier, a customs officer who had died of a fever that swept through the lower district, and after that she had buried herself in her work instead, because grief, she had learned, could be organized into columns just like everything else. Debits on one side, credits on the other. Somewhere in the reconciliation, she had found a kind of peace. Nobody at court remembered her name unless they needed a number confirmed. That was exactly how she wanted it. The palace itself sprawled across the hill above the capital like a great stone animal sleeping in the sun, its towers pale gold in the mornings and blood orange at dusk, its gardens tended by hands that never touched the money that made those gardens possible. Somewhere above Mira's basement office, in rooms with high ceilings and taller windows, the empress held court, and the chancellor whispered counsel into her ear, and the business of empire was conducted in velvet tones that never once acknowledged the existence of the woman 2 floors below who actually knew where every coin had gone. Chancellor Aldrich Thorne had served 3 emperors and now 1 empress, and he wore his decades of service like a medal that excused him from scrutiny. He was silver-haired, broad-shouldered despite his age, possessed of a laugh that could warm a cold room and a memory for names that made every noble feel personally chosen. He had built roads. He had negotiated 3 treaties that ended wars before they properly began. He had, by every account whispered in every hallway, given his life to the empire. Mira had audited his office's expenditures 4 times over the years and found nothing but tidy sums and reasonable requisitions. She would come to understand much later that tidiness itself should have been the first alarm. The audit that changed everything began, as most disasters do, with something almost embarrassingly small. It was a discrepancy of 11 silver marks in the quarterly grain subsidy ledger, the kind of rounding error that any other accountant would have shrugged off as a clerical slip and initialed away without a second thought. Mira did not shrug things off. She had built her entire professional identity around the radical belief that numbers meant something, that an 11-mark discrepancy was either a mistake that could be traced to a specific hand, or it was the visible tip of something submerged. She pulled the grain subsidy files back 3 months, then 6, then a year, and then 2. And by the time she had spread the ledgers across her entire desk in overlapping fans of parchment, the 11 silver marks had metastasized into something else entirely. A small tributary that fed into a slightly larger tributary, which fed in turn into a channel that had been dug so carefully over so many years that it had come to look like part of the natural landscape of the empire's accounts. She sat back in her chair and stared at the candlelight flickering against the stone ceiling. And for the first time in a very long while, her pulse picked up. Someone had built a river of gold, and they had built it to flow uphill. The following weeks consumed her the way grief once had, entirely, wordlessly, at the expense of sleep and food and every conversation that did not directly serve the pursuit. She told her supervisor she was conducting a routine deep audit of provincial subsidy allocations, which was true in the way that saying a house was on fire was true of a single burning candle. She requested archive access to records that predated her own tenure records, so old the ink had begun to brown at the edges, records that most people assumed had been filed away and forgotten because nobody would ever need them again. Mira needed them. She found the first shell account 11 days into her investigation. It was registered under the name of a grain cooperative in a province 300 miles from the capital, a cooperative that, according to the Agricultural Registry, had ceased operating 9 years prior. And yet the account remained open, remained active, remained the recipient of small, regular disbursements that arrived like clockwork every quarter, always just below the threshold that would have required a secondary signature for approval. Someone had understood the audit thresholds intimately. Someone had known exactly how much money could move without triggering a second set of eyes. She found the second shell account 4 days after that, tucked inside what appeared to be a legitimate road maintenance fund for the Northern Territories. Yes, the disbursements from this one were larger, but they were split, divided into portions, small enough to look like routine payments to a dozen different contractors whose names, when she cross-referenced them against the guild registries, did not exist. By the time she found the seventh account, she had stopped being surprised and started being methodical instead, which for Mira was a far more dangerous state to enter. Surprise faded. Method did not. She built a private ledger of her own, a shadow record that mapped every fraudulent account, every falsified cooperative, every ghost contractor, and every single thread, when drawn, taut, and followed to its origin, arrived at the same place. A holding registered 11 years earlier under a name that meant nothing to the casual observer. A name that, when she checked it against the property deeds filed in the capital's central archive, resolved to a modest countryside estate, 2 days' ride from the palace, an estate owned, quietly and entirely, by Chancellor Aldrich Thorne. She sat with that discovery for a long time before she let herself believe it. It would have been easy, in that moment, to feel fear. She understood exactly what she was looking at. She was looking at 10 years, perhaps 11, of systematic theft from the imperial treasury, orchestrated by the second most powerful person in the empire, hidden behind a labyrinth of shell accounts so elegantly constructed that it had survived 4 previous audits, 3 of which she herself had conducted without noticing a thing. She was looking at a man who had, over the course of a decade, quietly bled the empire, to build himself a private fortune, all while standing at the empress's shoulder and calling himself her most loyal servant. She was also looking at a very simple, very dangerous fact. She was the only person alive who had connected all the pieces. Mira had never considered herself brave. She had considered herself careful, which she had always believed was a different thing entirely, a lesser thing, a quieter virtue. But sitting alone in her basement office at 2 in the morning, surrounded by 11 years of stolen gold rendered down into neat columns of ink, she understood that carefulness and courage were not opposites at all. Sometimes carefulness was simply courage that had not yet been asked to move. She thought about her husband. Briefly, the way she always did when a decision loomed too large to face alone. He had been a customs officer, a man who believed with an almost embarrassing sincerity that rules existed to protect people, not merely to be enforced against them. He would have told her to bring the truth forward, plainly, without flourish, and let the truth do the work the truth was supposed to do. So, that was what she decided to do. She did not go to the Treasury Master, who reported directly to the Chancellor and would at best bury the findings and at worst hand them straight to the man they incriminated. She did not go to the Palace Guard, whose captain owed his position to Thorne's personal recommendation. She did not whisper it to a single soul in the corridors, not to the junior clerks who might have sold the information for a week's wages, not to the senior auditors who might have wanted the credit for themselves, not even to the one friend she had made in 11 years of solitary work. A records keeper named Halden, who had once brought her tea during a particularly brutal quarter close, and never asked for anything in return. She trusted no one with fragments. She would give the whole truth to exactly one person, and one person only. It took her 9 more days to prepare the final report, because she refused to bring anything forward that could not withstand the most hostile scrutiny imaginable. She rebuilt every account trail from its origin point twice, once forward and once backward. To be certain, the story it told was the same in both directions. She copied every falsified cooperative registration, every ghost contractor's forged guild seal, every disbursement record, every property deed into a single unified document written in a hand so precise it could have been mistaken for print. She included dates. She included totals, broken down by year, by province, by method of concealment. She included at the very end a simple sum that represented the total amount diverted over the past decade, a number so large that when she first calculated it, she checked her own arithmetic 4 separate times, refusing to believe it until the 4th pass returned the same result as the first. It was enough gold to have fed the empire's poorest province for 6 years running. It was enough gold to have paid for the entire eastern garrison twice over. It was, in the most literal sense, available to her. The missing gold that half the court had spent a decade quietly wondering about. The shortfall that had been blamed on bad harvests and border skirmishes and the general unpredictable expense of running an empire, when in fact it had simply been sitting in a countryside estate 2 days' ride away, converted into land and horses and silk and the quiet, comfortable trappings of a man who had built himself a second, secret life on the back of stolen trust. She sealed the report inside a plain envelope of heavy paper, the kind used for the most sensitive treasury correspondence, the kind that could not be opened and resealed without leaving a visible tear in the wax. She pressed her own personal seal into it, a small, unremarkable mark that identified her as the Treasury's senior auditor, a title that had never once mattered to anyone until this exact moment. She wrote no letter to accompany it. She added no commentary, no accusation, no plea for protection or reward. She understood with the same clarity she brought to a column of figures that the report needed to speak entirely for itself, because the moment she attached her own voice to it, it would become an accusation, a personal grievance, something that could be argued with or dismissed as the ambition of a woman reaching above her station. Left, silent, left as pure evidence, it became something far more dangerous. It became fact. Getting the envelope into the Empress's hands without passing through a single intermediary proved to be its own quiet campaign, one that demanded a different kind of competence than the one Mira had spent her career perfecting. She could not simply request an audience. Requests for audience passed through the Chancellor's office as a matter of standard protocol, and Thorne read every petition that crossed his desk with the attention of a man who had spent 11 years making certain nothing crossed it without his knowledge. Instead, Mira remembered a smaller truth she had absorbed over a decade of moving unnoticed through palace corridors, the kind of truth that only became visible to someone who had trained herself to see what others overlooked. The Empress took her morning tea in the Eastern Garden 3 days a week, alone except for a single lady-in-waiting, and she took a private, unscheduled walk along the garden's outer wall, precisely because it was the one part of her day the Chancellor's schedule did not touch. Mira had never spoken to the Empress. She had seen her exactly twice, from a respectful distance, across a crowded hall, and on both occasions she had done what she always did, made herself smaller, quieter, less worth noticing. On the morning she carried the sealed envelope beneath her gray shawl, she made herself the opposite. She waited at the edge of the garden path, where the roses gave way to a low stone wall overlooking the eastern hills, and when the Empress came around the bend with her lady-in-waiting trailing several respectful steps behind, Mira stepped forward and dropped into a full formal bow, lower and longer than protocol strictly required, the kind of bow that signaled not mere respect but urgency. The Empress paused. She was younger than the songs about her suggested, with dark, watchful eyes that missed very little, eyes that had learned, through 6 years on a throne, surrounded by advisers who each wanted something, to read a person's posture before their words. She studied Mira for a moment that felt to Mira like the full length of a held breath. Mira did not speak. She simply extended the envelope, both hands, head still bowed, and waited. It would have been entirely within the Empress's rights to have her arrested on the spot for the audacity alone, approaching the sovereign directly, bypassing every layer of court structure that existed precisely to prevent exactly this kind of unscheduled contact. Mira had considered that outcome and accepted it as a possibility before she ever left her office that morning. Some truths, she had decided, were worth the risk of being punished for delivering them. The empress did not call for the guard. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the plain wax seal, unfamiliar to her, bearing no crest, no housemark, nothing but a small, precise symbol she did not recognize. She looked finally at the woman kneeling before her, gray and unremarkable and utterly still, and something in that stillness must have told her more than words could have. She took the envelope. She asked no questions. Mira had not expected her to. A woman who had survived 6 years of court intrigue without losing her throne had almost certainly developed an instinct for recognizing the difference between a petitioner seeking favor and a messenger delivering a warning. The empress turned the envelope once in her hands, felt its weight, noted, perhaps, how thick it was for something delivered in such silence. Then she nodded once, a small, economical gesture, and walked on. Mira remained kneeling until the empress and her lady-in-waiting had disappeared around the garden's far hedge, and only then did she rise, her knees aching from the cold stone, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had done what she came to do. The rest was no longer hers to control, and there was a strange, almost frightening relief in that fact, the relief of having finally set down a weight she had been carrying alone for weeks. She walked back to her basement office and resumed her work as though nothing at all had happened. That was, she understood, the only role left available to her now. She was not a soldier, not a politician, not someone who could stand in a council chamber and level an accusation with the moral authority to make it stick. She was an accountant. She had done the only thing an accountant could do, which was to make the truth undeniable and then hand it to someone with the power to act on it. Whatever happened next would happen far above the floor she worked on, in rooms she would never enter, among people who would never know her name. She told herself that was fine. She told herself that for 3 days, in fact 3 days of ordinary ledgers and ordinary discrepancies, 3 days in which nothing in the palace seemed to shift at all, until the 4th morning when she arrived at her desk to find that the entire building felt different in a way she could not immediately name. The clerks were speaking in lowered voices. 2 junior accountants, who normally chattered through the corridor outside her office, fell silent when she passed, not out of their usual indifference, but out of something closer to unease. A runner from the upper floors delivered a routine requisition to her desk and lingered a moment too long, glancing at her with an expression she could not read, something between curiosity and caution, as though he was trying to decide whether she was the kind of person a smart man should be seen talking to. She said nothing. She asked nothing. She simply worked, the way she always worked, and let the palace's rumor mill do what rumor mills always did, which was to fill silence with speculation faster than any official announcement ever could. By midday, she had pieced together enough fragments from overheard conversations to understand the shape of what was happening, even if the details remained blurred. The Chancellor had been summoned to a private audience with the Empress that morning. Unscheduled, unannounced even to his own staff, a break from routine so unusual that his secretary had reportedly spent the better part of an hour trying to determine what could possibly warrant it. Nobody outside that room knew what had been said, but Chancellor Aldrich Thorne did not attend the afternoon council session. He sent no explanation. His seat at the long, polished table, the one he had occupied for longer than most of the current council members had been alive, sat empty for the first time in recorded memory. And the council, according to what Mira overheard from 2 ministers discussing it in hushed tones near the archive stairwell, had proceeded without him in a silence so thick, one of them described it as heavier than the summer heat outside. He did not attend the following session either, or the one after that. Within a week, his private staff had been quietly reassigned to other departments, a process handled with such careful bureaucratic ordinariness that anyone not looking closely would have assumed it was simply routine palace reshuffling, the kind that happened every few years as an efficiency measure. Mira, who understood better than almost anyone alive how quietly a system could be made to hide the truth, recognized exactly what she was watching. It was the same kind of careful, deliberate erasure that Thorne himself had once used to hide a decade of theft, now being turned against him, methodically, without a single public accusation ever being spoken aloud. There was no trial that Mira ever heard of, there was no announcement, no proclamation nailed to the palace gates, no public reckoning of the kind that the size of the crime might have seemed to demand. The empire, it turned out, did not always deal with its betrayals in the light. Sometimes it dealt with them the way water dealt with stone, slowly, patiently, until the thing that had once stood immovable simply was not there anymore. The countryside estate, Mira learned some weeks later from a passing comment between two clerks who had no idea she was the reason any of it had happened, was seized by the crown under a quiet writ of forfeiture. Its contents, its horses, its silk, its carefully accumulated comforts were catalogued and absorbed back into the very treasury they had been stolen from. The grain cooperative that did not exist was formally dissolved on paper. It had never truly occupied. The ghost contractors vanished from the registries as though they had simply been erased, which, in the most literal sense, they had, since they had never been anything but ink in the first place. And Chancellor Aldrich Thorne, the man who had built roads and negotiated treaties and worn the empress's trust like a second skin for over a decade, simply disappeared from public life. Mira heard 3 different rumors about where he had gone. One placed him under permanent house confinement in a remote holding, stripped of title and staff. One claimed he had been quietly exiled beyond the empire's borders, forbidden ever to return under threat of execution. One, the darkest, suggested he had never left the palace grounds at all, and that his absence from council was of a far more permanent nature than exile. Mira never learned which version was true, and, in time, she came to understand that not knowing was, in its own strange way, part of the point. The empress had not wanted a spectacle. A spectacle would have forced the entire court to reckon publicly with the fact that the second most trusted man in the empire had betrayed it for over a decade without a single audit catching him until now. And that kind of public reckoning could shake a throne as easily as steady it. What the empire needed was not vengeance performed loudly for an audience. It needed the theft to stop, the gold to be recovered where possible, and the wound to close as quickly and quietly as such a deep wound could be made to close. Mira had given the empress exactly the tool required to do that, and then she had stepped back into the silence from which she'd come. Nobody ever publicly credited her. There was no ceremony, no medal, no announcement naming the senior auditor whose work had unraveled a decade of fraud at the very top of the empire's power structure. For a woman who had spent her entire career believing that numbers spoke louder than names, this did not trouble her nearly as much as it might have troubled someone else. She had not delivered the envelope for recognition. She had delivered it because the ledger did not balance, and an unbalanced ledger, left unaddressed, was a wound that would only widen with time. But something did change, quietly, in the small, particular ways that mattered most to her. 3 weeks after the Chancellor's disappearance from council, a new treasury master was appointed. A stern, methodical woman named Ilse Koren, who had spent 20 years managing the accounts of the empire's largest shipping guild before being summoned, with unusual personal insistence, to the palace. Within her first month in the role, Koren restructured the entire audit approval process, adding a second layer of independent review to every account above a certain threshold. A threshold, Mira noted with some private satisfaction, set precisely at the level Thorne's shell accounts had been engineered to slip beneath. Koren also did something else, something smaller, something that Mira would remember for the rest of her career. She requested, by name, that Mira Voss be assigned as her personal deputy. It was not a public honor. It came with no announcement, no fanfare, no shift in Mira's gray uniform or her modest office 2 floors below the marble halls where the empire's business was conducted. But it came with a private letter, handwritten, unsealed by any official stamp, that Koren left on Mira's desk on her very first morning in the role. The letter contained only 2 sentences. I know what an 11-mark discrepancy can become in careful hands. I would like those hands working beside mine. Mira kept that letter for the rest of her life, tucked into the same drawer where she kept the last letter her husband had ever written her. 2 very different kinds of proof that quiet, careful people could still be seen by those paying proper attention. The empress, for her part, never spoke to Mira directly again, not in any conversation that history would ever record. But 6 months after the garden encounter, Mira received a formal notice from the Crown's own office, granting her a modest but meaningful increase in both rank and salary, citing, in the flat, careful language of official documents, exceptional diligence in matters of treasury oversight. There was no mention of shell accounts. There was no mention of a chancellor. There was only the dry, bureaucratic language of a system, quietly correcting itself, rewarding the person who had made that correction possible, without ever having to say her name too loudly. Mira understood the language perfectly. She had spent her whole life reading between the lines of numbers, and this was simply one more column that balanced. In the years that followed, the palace treasury operated with a rigor it had never known before, not because Chancellor Thorne's crime had been unique in the empire's long history. Corruption of one form or another had touched every reign before this one, and would touch every reign after, but because his downfall had proven something. No council member, and certainly no future chancellor, could afford to forget. Somewhere in the basement of the palace, unseen and unthanked, there existed a mind that could trace a single misplaced silver mark back through a decade of careful concealment to the exact hand that had hidden it. Nobody wanted to be the next entry in that ledger. Mira never sought out that kind of fear, and she took no particular pleasure in inspiring it. She simply continued, doing what she had always done, arriving before the sun cleared the towers, staying long after the night clerks lit their second round of lamps, following every number until it told her the truth, whether that truth was as small as a clerical error or as vast as a decade of stolen gold. She trained 2 apprentices over the following years, both of them quiet, careful people, much like herself, and she taught them the same principle that had guided her through the entire ordeal. The one lesson she believed mattered more than any technique of ledger reconciliation or account tracing. The numbers do not care who you are. They do not care about your title, your reputation, your decades of service, or how warmly you laugh in a crowded hall. They only care whether they add up. And if you are patient enough, and careful enough, and brave enough to follow them all the way to the end, they will always, eventually, tell you exactly where the truth is buried. She never married again. She kept her husband's letter, and eventually Corinne's, in the same drawer. And some quiet evenings long after the palace had gone dark around her, she would take them both out and read them. Not out of sorrow, but out of a settled, hard-won sense that her life, however small it might have looked from the marble halls above, had mattered in exactly the way she had always hoped it would. She had not needed a sword. She had not needed a title or an army or a single dramatic confrontation shouted across a crowded hall. She had needed only a ledger, a decade of patience she hadn't known she possessed until it was tested, and the quiet, unshakable conviction that the truth once fully assembled did not need her to raise her voice on its behalf. It only needed her to deliver it. And so she had. In the end, that was the story the palace never told in its official records, the one that existed only in the careful, unglamorous language of restructured audit thresholds and quietly reassigned staff and an empty chair at a long polished table that no one ever again took for granted. It was not a story of armies or thrones or dramatic last stands. It was the story of a woman in gray who noticed 11 silver marks that did not belong and who refused, with a stubbornness the rest of the world never saw coming, to let that small wrongness go unanswered. The gold went back where it belonged. The empire, in its own slow, careful way, healed the wound it hadn't known it was bleeding from. And, somewhere in the basement of a palace of gold and marble, an accountant who had once been invisible kept doing the only thing she had ever truly wanted to do, making certain that every column, in the end, told the truth. If this story stayed with you, that quiet reckoning, that gold finally finding its way home, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a different kind of hero, the kind who wins the battle with patience instead of steel. Let me know in the comments what you think became of the Chancellor. And if you'd like more stories of quiet competence winning out over quiet corruption, stay close. Until next time, keep your numbers honest and your ledgers balanced.